Okay, I've already made 3 parts of this, so if you don't know what this is, watch the other parts. Especially because all of the civilizations on this iceberg interconnect and build off one another in pretty interesting ways. So make sure to watch them right after you watch this. Nan Madol. Okay, so this is the first civilization on this list from Oceania, a region of the globe that most don't associate with ancient ruins, but there's pretty spectacular stuff there, like Nan Madol. Nan Madol is a spectacular megalithic city built on a coral reef just off the southern part of the island of Pohnpei. Yeah, I know, it sounds like Pompeii, but it's spelled with an H, now within the Federated States of Micronesia. And it's lush, fertile, and much larger than other volcanic islands in its region, which is of course what allowed Nan Madol to be built in the first place. It's made up of 98 artificial islands, linked by canals across 200 acres, all protected by 12 seawalls, earning it the apt nickname, the Venice of the Pacific. The name Nan Madol is actually a reference to this, as it means in the space between things, referring to its many canals. The buildings are built out of huge blocks of grayish-black volcanic basalt, which naturally breaks up into big hexagonal or pentagonal columns, similar to what was used at Gunung Padang. Remember that from part 2? Most of them are from the other end of the island, 25 miles away, at a volcanic plug called Puisen Malek, though there are some closer sources. Ultimately, the total weight moved is estimated to be at an astounding 750,000 metric tons. This colossal effort was headed by the Saudeleur dynasty, which is thought to have unified the island's numerous clans around 1160 under 2 sorcerer twins named Olisipa and Olisopa, who came from some unknown place to the west of the island. One of the brothers became the first Saudeleur, which just means Lord of Delure, another name for the island. In doing so, they essentially created the first centralized state in all of Oceania. It's said that they built Nan Madol in a single day using magical incantations, but turns out it's a bit more complicated than that. Both oral history and archaeology show that Nan Madol was actually inhabited prior to the rise of the Saudeleur, and the earliest artifacts found there date to the 1st and 2nd centuries. The construction of the islets began around the 8th or 9th centuries, but the earliest monumental tomb at the site, on an islet called Nandawas, was built from between 1180 and 1200, according to high-precision thorium-uranium series dates from the coral in its building fill. It's the most extravagant building there, and it has 2 sets of 25-foot-high walls containing what's thought to have been the royal mortuary, where the bodies of Saudeleur kings lied in state before being buried elsewhere. That's because Nan Madol was the Saudeleur's ceremonial center. On another little island called Idechta, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry, priests fed turtle guts to an eel that was believed to be a sea god in a ceremony known as the Puang En Sapu. And its existence has been verified by archaeology. The remains of turtles and small canals for eels to swim through have been found at Nan Madol, and the earliest radiocarbon dates connected to this strange ritual are from between 1200 and 1300 AD. Apparently, to this day, eels are considered holy and never eaten on Pohnpei. The Saudeleur started off as pretty chill rulers, but as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and they became both increasingly soft and increasingly tyrannical. They forced lesser chiefs to live in Nan Madol so they could keep an eye on them. They went out of their way to make eating dogs a privilege reserved only for them, and they just generally oppressed and overtaxed the Pohnpeians. One of them, named Rape Wen Lake, even supposedly used black magic to find the fattest people on the island, who he then fattened up even further until he ate them. In the 1620s, the last Saudeleur king, Sodom was defeated in a great battle by a foreign hero named Iso-Kelekel, who replaced their centralized regime with a more decentralized system, led by 3 and then later 5 different chiefs, themselves led by a guy called the Nan Mawarki, Iso-Kelekel himself being the first one of them. It's a system that continues on the island to this day. Iso-Kelekel supposedly lived on an island in Nan Madol called Pekapu, where he killed himself after seeing how old he looked when seeing his reflection in the water. About a century afterwards, the city was abandoned to the jungle, but various ceremonies still occurred there into the late 19th century. But I can't mention Nan Madol without mentioning an equally astonishing and very similar megalithic city, also in Micronesia, the city of Leilu off Kosrae, which is an island just east of Pohnpei. It features basalt structures built in the header and stretcher style used at Nan Madol, which are likewise connected by canals and protected by its own 1 kilometer long seawall. It continued functioning into the early 19th century when Europeans first came to the area, but uniquely it features its own truncated pyramidal tombs made of coral called saru in a section of the site called Insaru or Insrun, which were found to be filled with these neat shell beads. The earliest of these chiefly burials at the site is from, at earliest, 1310, just a century after the one at Nan Madol, and the two monuments of the Tuitonga in Tonga began being built around the same time in the 13th and 14th centuries. Also, like what happened on Pohnpei, the polity centered at Leilu unified the disparate polities of its own island, this time around 1400, and by the same time a 4-tier class system had been installed on the island. These are all developments potentially connected to something called the breadfruit revolution, when a new hybrid strain of breadfruit that was durable and could grow year-round started being cultivated. As a result, the population boomed, and there was enough of a labor force to start building big-ass stone structures, and to sustain cities like Nan Madol and Leilu, even though commoners couldn't live in them. There's also another set of ruins on Kosrae called the Menke ruins, which are thought to be even older than both Leilu and Nan Madol. Coincidentally, it happens to be a set of temples dedicated to their breadfruit goddess, Sinlaka, who is also their principal deity, and the oral histories of the region acknowledge it as a central, pivotal part of Eastern Micronesia's cultural systems. It also features a field of colossal stone heads, which earns it points in my book. Also, the ancient aliens crowd have jumped onto Nan Madol and claimed that the only possible way it could have been built was
through a process of levitation.
But the stones were probably just taken to the site on big rafts and then put in place with ropes and levers. I also found it odd that there don't seem to be any depictions of living things from Nan Madol, but there is actually some really interesting fading rock art on Pohnpei called the Pohnpei petroglyphs, which might be connected to the site. They include a ton of depictions of what at first glance look like swords, but are actually just loom pegs. The Mitanni. Despite being smack bang in the middle of the Middle East, the Empire of Mitanni is yet another Indo-European, or at least Indo-European dominated culture, except unlike the other ones we've covered, this time it actually has some written history attached to it. Its heartland was along the upper Kabur River between the Tigris and Euphrates, but at its height it encompassed all of northern Syria, southeastern Anatolia, and even Assyria for a time, but it was rather short-lived, and was only really an empire for under 2 centuries, from approximately 1540 or 1500 BC to approximately 1360. But they did sort of limp on into the early 13th century BC. It was primarily made up of a people known as the Hurrians, who liked making these really ornate incense burners for whatever reason. Their language, Hurrian, was part of an extinct, isolated language family known as Hurro-Urartian, which they wrote down using cuneiform, but curiously enough, it contained various Indo-European words closely related to Sanskrit, like the names of many of its kings, the name Mitanni itself, and words having to do with horses, famously written down in a charioteering manual by a guy named Kukuli. They even worshipped Vedic gods like Indra and Varuna. As such, it's possible that Mitanni was formed by mercenaries or warrior kings who used their epic chariots to replace local Hurrian dynasties and became a new sort of elite class, which quickly adopted local customs. At the very least, the Hurrians had heavy contact with such a group, who they called the Marianu, and somehow formed a confederation out of their various smaller states. They also acquired vassal cities like Aleppo, Carchemish, and Alalak, one of whose vassal rulers was this charming chap in the British Museum named Idrimi. Mitanni first emerged as the old Babylonian Empire was going into decline and helped facilitate it, allowing the Hittites to sack Babylon around 1595 BC. But it's most famous for briefly being Egypt's arch-rival because they were both trying to incorporate the Levant into their spheres of influence. Most famously, Pharaoh Thutmose III fought the Battle of Megiddo against a confederation of local Syrian rulers backed by Mitanni, or Wretched Naharin as the Egyptians called them, which shows that proxy wars aren't anything new in the region. Thutmose even created a whole new kingdom called Nukash-She, which served as a client state meant to put Mitanni in check. He also directly met the king of Mitanni in battle too, and defeated him, before going on to cross the Euphrates in his year 33. Thutmose even claimed to have conquered Mitanni, but that shouldn't really be taken at face value. Thutmose's son, Amenhotep II, fought some pretty ruthless campaigns against them, but he eventually arranged peace with them too, and his son and grandson, Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III, both married Mitanni princesses. But no Egyptian princesses ever married Mitanni rulers, because the Egyptians felt that they were above all that. With expansion along the coast being checked by Egypt and the border between them otherwise set at the Orontes, Mitanni was forced to turn east to expand. It reached its apex under a king named Shaushtatar, either around Amenhotep II's time or in the early 15th century BC. The chronology is a bit dubious. His crowning achievement was his sacking of the city of Assur, the home base of the Assyrians, and flexed on them by sending the doors of its palace back to his capital at Washukani, the Mitanni capital. That might sound like an odd piece of booty, but keep in mind that they were made of silver and gold, so they were pretty valuable doors. Mitanni's last truly independent king was named Tushratta, who ruled around the mid-14th century BC, and had a pretty bad time as king after he was placed on the throne following the murder of his older brother. His reign was contested by a guy called Artatama II, who ruled the northeast of the kingdom, and in the meantime he lost Assyria, and even the area around Washukani itself was sacked by the Hittite king Shupalululiuma I. These guys have insane names, I know. Anyways, the Egyptians were on good terms with him, and his daughter Gilukipa even married both Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, but they probably found him a bit annoying because he was constantly pestering them for golden statues, as preserved in the Amarna letters. Like his big bro before him, he was murdered, and by his own sons no less. And after another 10 years of civil war between different claimants to the throne, Tushratta's son Matiwaza, or Shatiwaza, became a puppet of his father's arch-rival, the great Hittite king Shupalululiuma, after he had installed him on the throne. But in exchange, he had to cede all land west of the Euphrates to the Hittites. Artatama II's line became puppets of the Assyrian king Assur-uballit, and after experiencing a few more vassal kings, Mitanni was annihilated twice over by both Adad-nirari I and Shalmaneser of Assyria during the early 13th century BC, after their vassal Mitanni kings rebelled against them, forever putting Mitanni, then known as Hani-Galbat, to an end. Because the Mitanni Empire was situated right where the Kurds exist today, some have proposed that the people of Mitanni are actually the ancestors of the Kurds, but I mean, probably not. Despite how archaeologically rich the region is and the fact that it controlled important cities, Mitanni is pretty poorly attested in the archaeological record. Its capital, the city of Washukani, and other major cities of its domain like Kahat and Taide remain unidentified. But don't get me wrong, it's not like there aren't any Mitanni sites out there. One of the first to be excavated was Nuzi, or Yorgan Tepe, in the 20s and 30s. It gave its name to a peculiar type of pottery known as Nuzi ware, which I think looks pretty cool. Other known Mitanni centers include Tel Brak, which features a palace associated with workshops and a temple, which was destroyed by the Assyrians twice over, as I mentioned. There's also Musulman Tepe along the upper Tigris, also with a palace, workshops, and temples, which were also probably torched by the Assyrians. And just a few years ago, one of Mitanni's cities, named either Zahiku or Mehune or Kamune, sources differ, was actually rediscovered in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2019, after a drought, since it had just been sitting at the bottom of the Mosul Dam reservoir. Its main feature is a palace decked out with bright murals in red and blue. Besides this and Nuziware, though, there isn't much known Mitanni art, except that a few items from the tomb of Tutankhamun of all places are thought to be either gifts from Mitanni or derived from Mitanni art, possibly even the famous dagger of his made from meteoric iron, and his chariot outfit, including some of the earliest socks in the world. I wrote a whole college paper about it. But it's also possible that glass was first produced en masse in the Mitanni Empire around 1600 BC. The technology then made its way to Egypt shortly thereafter in the 16th or 15th centuries BC, possibly through Mitanni glassmakers being brought to Egypt as prisoners of war, or as tribute resulting from the campaigns of Thutmose III. I mean, it's also how the chicken first came to Egypt, after all. They're called birds who remarkably give birth daily. In the Amarna letters written in Akkadian, raw glass is called ehli paku, which is a Hurrian term, or Meku stones, and huge quantities of the stuff seem to have been sent to the pharaoh, who tightly controlled the glass trade in Egypt, by his groveling vassals ruling cities in the Levant. The Chinchorro. The Chinchorro lived along a 900-kilometer stretch of what's now the southern coast of Peru and the northern coast of Chile, in the world's driest desert, the Atacama, between roughly 7,000 to 1100 BC. If you're a weirdo who's oddly obsessed with mummies, like me, then I bet you've probably heard about this culture somewhere, because the main thing the Chinchorro are known for is the fact that they were the first people to artificially mummify their dead, and they did it in 4 pretty unique and rather grisly ways, so if you're a bit squeamish, I'd recommend skipping ahead. What makes their mastery over mummification even more astonishing is the fact that otherwise the Chinchorro were a rather mundane culture. They lacked metal and even pottery, and mainly just subsisted off of whatever they could get from the sea. In fact, roughly 20% of the Chinchorro actually suffered from bone growths in their ears that were the result of constantly diving. So I guess that's what you feel in your ears when you dive too far down? I don't know. They were also just barely sedentary, living in small groups within permanent coastal campsites, which are actually few in comparison with all their cemeteries. These cemeteries are concentrated between the modern cities of Arica and Cobijo, which contain 10 sites in which nearly 300 mummies have been found. They first started artificially mummifying bodies around 5000 BC and abandoned the practice 6 centuries before they disappeared as social cohesion seems to have broken down. The first and most complex mummies they made belonged to the so-called black type. This type of mummification entailed cutting off a body's head and limbs, totally defleshing it, and then removing the brain. The embalmer would then cover the remaining bones and remodel the body with an unbaked clay paste, and would reinforce it with sticks and ropes. The skin, especially from the face, as well as the hair, was then put back onto the clay model and then covered in black manganese paint, which they were also inadvertently poisoning themselves with, by the way. This paint was applied really thickly onto the face, so the embalmer could further model the eyes, nose, and mouth, which is why their faces look so abstract. These mummies are incredibly fragile because the unbaked paste cracks apart really easily. Then there are the so-called red mummies, made between 2500 and 2000 BC. As you can imagine, they were painted red instead of black, except for their faces. These mummies were completely disarticulated and then had their insides stuffed with hot ashes or coals to dry them out, and then they were literally stitched back together after having been stuffed with various substances and sticks to hold them together. They also wrapped some red mummies in bandages, sort of like the Egyptians, but strangely, only the bodies of children were ever given this treatment. And the last artificial mummies they made, before just leaving their dead to mummify naturally, are those of the mud-coated type. They were smoked dry, and then a layer of mud around 2 centimeters thick, bound together by their blood, or the blood of a sea lion, was applied to them. That then became a cement-like substance that was glued to the very floor of their grave. All these different methods might have signified ideological changes, but who knows? The mystery intensifies because they didn't really have any lavish grave goods or anything really indicative of social stratification. The mummies were just wrapped in reed mats or camelid skin and given simple objects like baskets, hooks, and stone tools. But the Chinchorro also made little clay figurines that resemble their mummies. The main depository of these mummies is the San Miguel de Azapa Archaeological Museum, east of Arica, a town built over their cemeteries, which is best exemplified by the Museo de Sitio Colón 10, also in Arica, where you can stand over an intact Chinchorro cemetery, visible through glass panes. The Chinchorro were ultimately succeeded by the poorly understood Chiani phase, where people started being buried in semi-flexed positions with elaborate headdresses, and stopped being artificially mummified. The Sintashta culture. The Sintashta culture was a rather short-lived but incredibly influential culture which existed between 2100 and 1750 BC in a small region just east and south of the Urals, in what's now Russia, and a little tiny portion of northern Kazakhstan. They developed from the easternmost extremities of an offshoot of the corded ware culture called the Abashevo, which began exploiting the copper deposits in the Urals and engaged in pretty large-scale warfare based on evidence like the Pepkino mass grave. So yeah, they weren't kidding around. The Sintashta were more sedentary than their Abashevo ancestors and built a number of large fortified settlements, including the site that the culture is named after, mainly at low spots along the banks of small steppe streams where they could exert control over the marshlands where they herded the livestock they relied on. But at the same time, the steppe was becoming both colder and more arid, so competition over the shrinking marshlands became intense. Because of that, all of the Sintashta culture's centers were equipped with timber-reinforced walls, earthen walls surrounded by ditches, and even towers, and it's possible that up to 2,500 people lived in one called Archaim, and there were other large ones like Kamenyi Ambar. They were also very densely packed, being filled with standardized houses, which had shared walls, their own wells, and, curiously enough, even their own bronze-smelting furnaces. But even though their houses are rather egalitarian, and there weren't any Sintashta palaces, it's clear that warriors enjoyed special status. Even though they didn't possess much material wealth in life, in the burial mound cemeteries paired with their settlements, they were buried with whole war chariots, complete with sacrificed horses. Miraculously, the exact imprints of some of their now long-gone wheels have survived in the dirt slots they were embedded in. These are actually the oldest war chariots in the world, because the Sintashta probably invented them, so the pharaohs would have never had their chariots, and none of the big chariot battles of the late Bronze Age would have happened without these guys all the way up in Russia, which is crazy to think about, eh? It's also possible that they smelted bronze so intensively because they were the ones supplying the Near East with a lot of its tin-infused bronze, since from 2000 BC onwards they were exploiting the tin in the Zaravshan Valley. At the same time, the amount of tin-infused bronze in adjacent Bactria Margiana sites spikes, and from there the tin probably wound up in the Indus Valley and Elam, where it was then sent to Syria and Anatolia. Their horses also went on to become the ancestors of all modern domesticated horses, and in tandem with this, the Sintashta themselves had quite a genetic legacy. Even though the Sintashta culture ended around 1850 BC as their elites lost power and their centralized chiefly communities transformed into smaller, unfortified villages, they spread way further to the south and east to create the Andronovo culture, which almost completely replaced the previous inhabitants of the Central Asian steppe, and eventually brought about both the Vedic people of India and the Iranians, as well as the whole Indo-Iranian language family. Classic Veracruz. The classic Veracruz culture occupied the Gulf Coast of Mexico in what's now the Mexican state of Veracruz, just north of our buds, the Zapotecs. It existed from around the 4th to 13th centuries, and it's somewhat poorly understood. Even the identity of the people responsible for it is still up for debate. The Totonac people occupied the state of Veracruz during the Spanish conquest and to the present, and some scholars have assumed that the people of classic era Veracruz were Totonac, but it's possible that the original inhabitants left for southern Mexico and Guatemala when the civilization collapsed around 1200. I don't mean to offend anyone with Totonac ancestry, but what the post-classic Totonacs left behind is definitely substantial enough to warrant its own entry. Maybe I'll add them to the iceberg. I'm just going to run through their major sites real quick, just so you can get a picture of who these guys were. The most important classic Veracruz site by far is the great city of El Tajín, once the center of its own little city-state. It contains 200 separate mounds covering an area of 1.9 square miles, including some pretty epic pyramids, and once may have had a population of over 15,000 people. Before the fall of Teotihuacan, it was just a minor town, but after Teotihuacan's calamitous fall from around 550 to 1000 AD, El Tajín became incredibly prosperous. The most imposing product of this is the Pyramid of the Niches. Completed sometime after the year 600, it's a 60-foot high marvel, which features 365 niches for every day of the year, but no one really knows why they're there. It's possible that they held effigies of different gods in them, but who knows. It also had a dozen ball courts decorated with important reliefs we'll get back to later, and some of its more well-preserved buildings even had their amazing original paint jobs up till recently, when some loony set them on fire. It was largely abandoned in the year 1200 because of a fire, ironically, and military activity, and was inhabited by Totonacs for a bit before being forgotten until the 19th century. Another major site of theirs is Cerro de las Mesas, the largest early classic site in the region. It was originally an Olmec site and could arguably be called a part of the Epi-Olmec culture that succeeded them. In addition to hundreds of mounds, it also features a bunch of important stelae, including 4 which bear the last instances of the mysterious Epi-Olmec script, which I mentioned when covering the Olmecs, and these are associated with long count dates in the 5th and 6th centuries. There's also Remojadas, which produced a ton of its own unique type of incredibly lively ceramic sculptures, most of which are shown grinning for some reason, possibly as a way of depicting the effects of hallucinogens, but maybe they are just happy people. I also want to shout out another site, El Zapotal, near Cerros de las Mesas. It features big, unexcavated pyramid mounds, like El Gallo here, that locals believe will only yield its treasures to those who hear a cock crow, or see a green light emanate from it on Good Friday. But this site's most important treasure has to be its stunning shrine to the underworld god. The enthroned skeletal god was found with vivid murals and more than 200 real skeletons, which were mixed up with a huge trove of some of the most amazing ceramic sculptures I've ever seen. But the one thing besides ceramics that the people of classic period Veracruz were most obsessed with was their ball game, and they've left plenty of pretty astonishing art connected to it. The most notable of which are so-called yokes, or yugos, which are these very hard and very heavy greenstone semicircles, which are thought to represent frogs for whatever reason, maybe because of their association with the earth and therefore the underworld. They're stone versions of protective belts that ball game players would have worn to protect themselves from the hard rubber balls they played with. The real ones were probably made of much lighter materials like cotton and leather. They were probably just used in rituals, put on display, or buried in the graves of ball game players, which is where they're often found. And they made other types of ball game related adornments called hachas, or axes, and palmas, or palms, which would have been put on top of the yokes and depict all sorts of different really stylized animals, which might have been the mascots of different teams. But there was definitely a dark side to this ball game, as illustrated by some of the carved reliefs decorating some of the dozen ball courts found at El Tajín, which depict ball game players being sliced open by priests. Both are shown wearing yokes with palmas fitted into them, so it's likely that these depict the outcome of a game, which reminds me of similar reliefs lining Chichen Itza's giant ball court. There are even palmas depicting sacrificed prisoners, so imagine that being the mascot of your local team. Anyways, that's enough about them, but I do have to add that they heavily inspired the partially contemporaneous Huastec culture, which existed in northern Veracruz, which we're gonna get to later down. A civilization we'll get to later on. The Urnfield culture. The Urnfield culture, also known as the Urnfield tradition, lasted from the 13th to 8th centuries BC, so that's roughly 1300 to 700 BC, at the very end of the Bronze Age. They're called that because they left cemeteries made up of cremation urns buried under fields and accompanied by their weapons and ornaments, so it's actually pretty self-explanatory. Honestly, Urnfield culture would have made a great name for the as-yet unnamed culture that made the Plain of Jars in Laos, but I guess they can still have Jarfield or whatever. Anyways, the Urnfield culture grew out of the tumulus culture, which preferred making inhumations covered by barrows, and although later Urnfield burials often did go unmarked, some were covered with mounds. The Urnfields first appeared in East Central Europe, around the upper Danube, and along the Po River of northern Italy around 1300 BC, and then proceeded to spread out until by around 1000 BC, the Urnfield culture spanned Europe from as far west as the Pyrenees and Catalonia, and as far east as western Ukraine. And along with the Urnfields, they also spread their awesome hill forts and the use of forged sheet bronze across Europe. And that brings us to the most well-known thing about these guys, and the reason why I initially put them on the iceberg in the first place. The fact that they're Europe's first recognizably proto-Celtic culture. Initially, the spread of the Urnfields was thought to be directly linked to Celtic expansion, which isn't really the case, but they are linked to the later Celts in a more roundabout way, because the Urnfield culture led to the rise of the Hallstatt culture, covered in part 2, which did go on to bring about the Asterix and Obelix type Celts we all know and love. And to make things even more confusing, the Urnfield culture wasn't actually a monolithic, unified culture. It's actually divided into a ton of localized regional cultures, some of which continued well on into the Iron Age, like the Lusatian culture, which spread across eastern Germany, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, and even western Ukraine. And on top of that, the Urnfield culture is connected with the rise of multiple different ethnicities, not just the Celts. Urnfield migrations, or at least the adoption of Urnfield technologies and rituals from Central Europe, are seen as the reason for the emergence of the Proto-Villanovan culture, which lasted from 1100 to 900 BC and spread over much of Italy. In keeping with Urnfield tradition, they're best known for their distinctive two-storied cremation urns, with imitations of Urnfield helmet types or in the shape of terracotta huts, typical of Northern European Urnfields. The thing is, these guys are responsible for the rise of later Italic cultures like the Latins, who of course went on to create Rome, so it's funny to think that the Urnfield culture might have been the last common link between both Asterix and Julius Caesar, or Thomas Shelby and Tony Soprano, however you want to frame it. It's also clear that the people of the Urnfield culture were intensely warlike, which might have something to do with the chaos and violence the Mediterranean saw during the Bronze Age collapse, which was going on at around the same time. The Urnfield culture created huge amounts of beaten bronze arms and armor, because as they became more militarized, heavy-duty bronze armor like helmets, greaves, and cuirasses, possibly loosely based on the panoplies of the Mycenaeans, became way more important. I especially like the early cuirasses they adopted, because their nips are often designed to look like little radiant suns. Swords also became longer and became better at cutting and slashing instead of just thrusting, as they adopted flange-hilted swords, which they may have independently invented. But the most imposing testaments to their proclivity for warfare are the huge hill forts they've left behind all over Europe, which I find really impressive because they're just impossible to ignore reminders of these people from 3,000 years ago. I mean, people quite literally still live in their shadows. Germany has a bunch of cool ones, like Hünenberg by Wattenstedt, Fahrenberg, Gelbeberg, and Ipf, which is a really cool looking natural mountain that Urnfield people leveled off and fortified. But my favorite has to be the megafort of Cornești Iarcuri in Romania. It's an enormous complex covering over 17 square kilometers that consists of 4 rings of ramparts, palisades, and moats. Just look at the huge imprint it made. And there's another so-called megafort in Romania called Santania. The density and uniformity of these megaforts in Romania, as well as some in Serbia, like Gradište Doš, suggest that they operated under the same political framework, and might have even belonged to some sort of archaic state, even though it's likely that the Urnfield culture was generally divided up into tribes. But the most obvious evidence of the wars they fought has to be both who and what they left behind at Europe's oldest known battlefield, which dates to the 13th century BC, when the Battle of Kadesh and the Trojan War were raging on further south. It's the Tollens Valley battlefield, so named because it was fought along an ancient causeway meandering along the swampy landscape surrounding the small Tollens River in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, northeast Germany. The skeletons of at least 125 men of fighting age, as well as a few women, children, and horses, were found there, and the site's not fully excavated yet, so it's estimated that up to 1,500 more people could still be lying there. It's even been estimated that between 2,000 to 7,000 warriors were initially involved in the actual battle that took place there, which would have been an insane feat of organization for the time. It was only found in 1996 when someone stumbled across a bone with a flint arrow embedded in it, but given the Urnfield culture's predilection for bronze, a ton of bronze arrowheads and weapons were also found scattered along the battlefield, and of course all the grisly wounds that these weapons created. It seems that some of the battle's participants traveled hundreds of miles before winding up there, as exemplified by a toolkit found at the bottom of the Tollens River, which probably belonged to someone from somewhere in south-central Europe. And isotope analysis of remains from the battlefield published in 2017 indicated that tons of non-locals, possibly from Czechia and southern Germany, were also involved. This might be connected to Urnfield mercenaries roving across Europe, best exemplified by the Urnfield Cemetery at Neckarsulm in southwest Germany, which contained 50 robust adult male individuals who exhibited signs of being engaged in horseback riding and were buried with weapons. Strangely, they bucked the Urnfield trend and weren't cremated, and even more curiously, the Neckarsulm cemetery contained burials with multiple different men in it, probably because they were felled in battle at the same time. Some 37 of these individuals had their teeth subjected to strontium isotope analysis, which revealed that 1/3 of them weren't local to the area. In addition to controlling incredibly significant tin and amber trade routes, which wound their way all the way down into the Mediterranean, bands of Urnfield mercenaries from the Balkans as far north as the Danube may have even served in Mycenaean palaces, probably how the Mycenaeans adopted the versatile flange-hilted Central European now two-type swords in the 12th and 11th centuries BC. Damn, what a mouthful. Which must have proven its worth against Mycenaean swords at some point. This special type of sword even made its way to the Near East. Also, the presence of a pretty shitty pottery type called handmade burnished ware coexisting with late Helladic pottery at late Mycenaean sites might represent foreign arrivals from the north, even though the Urnfield culture could produce much better stuff. But the role that the Urnfield culture and its mercenaries played in mysterious episodes of upheaval in the Aegean, like the collapse of the Mycenaeans and the Dorian invasion, and the creation of the Sea Peoples of course, possibly as a result of the former two, is still way up in the air. They were also some of the first people in non-Far Eastern Europe to utilize war chariots, some of the first evidence of which being this little line drawing on a 14th century BC cremation urn from eastern Slovakia, as well as these miniature ritual chariots and wagons that they were really fond of making, which often bear depictions of water birds of all things, and contain vessels which were used as fat-burning lamps during rituals or even to carry cremated remains. This probably has something to do with the popularity of the sunbird barge motif, which consists of a rather abstract bird-headed ship embellished with solar imagery that may allude to how the bird was thought to accompany or guide the sun. It essentially became Europe's dominant symbol during the late Bronze and early Iron Ages after it emerged sometime in the early Urnfield period, and there had to have been some sort of shared understanding of its significance among the many different peoples of the Urnfield tradition, because it's found absolutely everywhere, and on things ranging from pendants to vessels to greaves underneath those cuirasses with the sun nips. Unlike in the contemporary Near East, these guys didn't have temples, and they didn't depict their gods as humans either, so this symbol was one of the only ways they depicted the supernatural, which seems to have revolved around the sun. But like their bell-beaker ancestors in the early Bronze Age, they were also really fond of solar imagery on gold. Like on this stunning gold bowl, which a railroad worker stumbled across in 1906 in Altstetten near Zurich. It's decorated with suns, crescent moons, and 7 peculiar little animals, including deer, goats, and a possible fox of unknown significance. They also produced the biggest gold hoard ever to be found in Germany, the Eberswald hoard, found in Eberswald, Brandenburg, which featured more stunning golden bowls with very obvious astronomical imagery on them. It has a rather odd modern history too. After the downfall of the Third Reich in 1945, the Soviets took it back to Moscow as war booty, and it's still locked in storage there to this day. Golden bowls with solar imagery on them, like those in the Eberswald hoard, have been found as recently as 2021. During that accursed year, salvage excavations around Ebrechtsdorf near Vienna uncovered an Urnfield golden bowl with a very obvious sun at its base, buried next to a dwelling within a small Urnfield settlement. It was probably a votive offering, especially since it was found to contain golden wire bracelets and the remains of fabric or leather once stitched with gold. And there's tons of other examples of less obviously cultic Urnfield treasures too, like the oldest gold from Slovenia, these stunning gold appliques found dumped in Lake Bled, which were probably stitched to a high-status woman's headgear. The vellum treasure from Hungary, which also probably belonged to some high-ranking lady, and the stunning Hinova treasure in Sarasau hoard from Romania. But by far the most spectacular and deservedly famous treasures they produced have to be these strange, thin, golden hats, intricately adorned with various astronomical symbols. And of course, they look like what Gandalf would wear if he went out clubbing. Only 4 of these have ever been found, 3 in Germany and 1 in France, and they're thought to date to between 1400 and 800 BC. The most famous of the 4 has to be the Berlin gold hat, which has pride of place at Berlin's Neues Museum, despite only ending up there in 1996, and with its original find spot remaining totally unknown. It likely acted as a sort of lunisolar calendar, tracking both lunar and solar cycles, and conversions between them. These crescents and eye motifs probably represent the moon and Venus, while circles are thought to represent both the sun and the moon. I'm a bit too dumb to understand exactly how it works, but apparently it charts 57 months and the 19-year-long cycle it takes for the solar and lunar years to realign, and for the moon's phases to recur on the same days of the solar year, which can also be used to predict eclipses. So, in keeping with their appearances, they may have really been worn by wizard-esque sages who meticulously documented the passage of time, especially since they do actually have human head-shaped holes, and they're thought to have been thin gold surfaces for a now long-gone organic base. And there are tons of interesting parallels to them from all over Europe, like shorter golden hats produced in Spain and Ireland, the somewhat older diadems from the royal tombs of Mycenae, bowls like those of the Eberswald hoard and the Austrian one found in 2021, and it's possible that they were even depicted in 2D on the stelae found in the so-called Kivik Kingsgrave all the way up in Sweden. This all of course ties in to the obsession Bronze Age Europeans had with the sun. The Urnfield culture even built its own bootleg earthwork Stonehenge at a place called Galoring near Koblenz in the Rhineland. Like Stonehenge, it was probably used to document solstices, but it only had a single wooden pole at its center. Also, 3 strange stones etched with concentric circles, probably depicting the sun, are scattered across Lower Saxony, and they're probably also connected to crazy Urnfield sun rituals, which we'll never know the details of because the Urnfield culture lacked a written language. Or did they? Well, they kind of had one. They definitely had a numerical system, which they of course used for calendrical purposes. We know that because they left behind tons of bronze sickles across Europe, and many of these were cast with the digits in their numerical system. It's just made up of 2 symbols, a slash and a backslash, representing 1 and 5 respectively. Almost all of the sickle inscriptions only represent numbers up to 30, so they're probably connected to the lunar month. It probably had its roots in counting with fingers, because you can mimic it pretty well by just counting 1s on your left and 5s on your right, and coincidentally, you don't run out of fingers until you reach 30. These same sickles also bear more abstract symbols, which might actually represent the Urnfield culture's very own form of proto-writing, which is also found on metal ingots too, so it was probably relevant to trade somehow. More of these sickles have been found as recently as 2023 in the Swiss Alps, which just goes to show how much is still out there, just waiting to be found. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry it's taken like 2 to 3 months to get this out. I went to South America for the first time, I finished my exams for my first year of college, and I was finally monetized thanks to all of you watching. Without your support and constant encouragement, I would have never gotten to anywhere near this point, so thank you all so much. And of course, I want to extend a big thanks to all of my esteemed patrons. Starting with Dhruv Singhal, Booga420, Ronnie G, Bajun, Julia Erickson, Harrison Timperley, Danny Banani, Doc Bossman, Mark Elliott Cullen, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bom Tom Badil, Hugo S, Rose Klein, James Kirk, Hugh Depan, Alyssa P, Miha Nidog, and of course our newest patron, Pashamek Wierzbicki. I apologize if I mispronounced that. The next video will likely be part 1 of the Out of Place Artifacts Iceberg. See you then.